So we've got the two top plackets stitched along the top. We are working on creating a front placket the right side now. Dog sweater pattern. If you're working with the extra generally you want to do a sweater in a nice stretch. So the first thing I want to do is I want to use my chalk, especially with such a small seam. But the stitching line shows you it comes all the way down to here. But the cut mark is this little dot here. So I'm just going to transfer this marking onto my pattern piece. We're going to line it up. Now I like to move so that I know where to cut my top edge down about not quite a quarter. You can transfer the other markings if you want, so that when the seam's sewn and it's folded over, the top is sitting even. So I've got my marking here, so wherever your seam allowance is going to be is how far you want to take my scissors, and I want to cut just to that marking. This pattern, it is designed so that you can line the edges up with the cut mark for the placket. But sometimes you have to watch the placement. We're just depending on where the pattern sits. Two placket to just make sure we're going to fold your right sides together, stitching line, and we're just going to stitch this top at a 1/4 inch. The other thing to watch out when you're doing this is you really need to be careful, making sure that if you have any direction on your pattern, stitching point that not any it stays lined up, and you don't have to be exactly equal on both sides. Funny when it's done. I'll explain further why when we get to that part. Hi, Darcy here from Purple Pixie Fashion. We are working on creating a front placket in the dog sweater pattern. I'm working on the extra small here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to use my chalk, and on the pattern piece, the stitching line shows you it comes all the way down to here. But the cut mark is this little dot here. So I'm just going to transfer this marking onto my pattern piece, and I'll be right back. So we've got the two top plackets stitched along the top. We're just going to turn them around the right side now. If you're working with, generally you want to do a sweater in a nice stretch, so I don't really worry about pressing or clipping, especially with such a small seam. But if you're working with a larger piece or bulky fabric, you might want to trim that seam down before attaching it. So the next stage is we're going to line it up. Now I like to move my top edge down about not quite a 1/4 inch, but almost, so that when the seam's sewn and it's folded over, the top is sitting even. So wherever your seam allowance is going to be is how far you want to move it down. This pattern, it is designed so that you can line the edges up with the cut mark, but sometimes you have to watch the placement depending on where the pattern sits to just make sure that your stitching line, you're stitching along the stitching line. The other thing to watch out when you're doing this is you really need to be careful that you're going down as far as the stitching point and not any further, and they have to be exactly equal on both sides. I'll explain further why when we get to that part, but this is very important that you stitch them both to the exact same point. So we know our cut points here, so we're going to do our stitching line just below, and you need a little bit to work with down there, a little bit of extra fabric. I'm going to take that over to the sewing machine, attach it, and I'll be right back. Okay, so we've completed stitching the two placket pieces on. I've left a little bit of room at the top for my seam allowance. I've come down not all the way to the end. I need a little bit to work with down here, and I've made sure that my two stitching lines end in the same spot. With stretch fabric, you have a little bit of wiggle room you can work with. It has a little bit of forgiveness to it. If it's a woven, it does not have any forgiveness. It needs to be exact. Now I'm just going to take my little snips, and I'm going to cut diagonally down, forming a little triangle flap. I'm going to cut to just a hair away from where my stitching ends. And I want to cut through just the one layer of the fabric. I don't want to be cutting through the layers of the placket. So I'm going to use my fingers to pull it out of the way so that I'm only cutting through the fabric on that diagonal, a hair mark away from where the stitching ends. So I've got my little triangle piece. I've cut diagonally down to a hair mark away. I have not cut my placket panels. So now that that's done, we're going to fold the plackets in on themselves, crossing one over the other, making sure this triangle piece is pulled through. You want to overlap them, pull this triangle piece tight. Now you can see where your stitching lines end. You need to stitch across from that point, straight across, as straight as you can, making sure you're holding that triangle piece tight and you're stitching straight across it. Want to make sure your flaps are crossed over one another and you've got a nice clean edge there. I'll be right back after stitching that. You can see a nice clean square point. It's not puckering because I haven't stitched past my stitching points. I've only stitched to them on the other side. Crosses over and lines up nicely. Nice placket opening. On the underside, you can see when I stitched across, I pulled my fabric tight, made sure I pulled that little triangle tight, and stitched from one seam to the other across. And I like to back tack it just to make sure it's nice and secure. If that lifts up, it's going to come out and be all frayed. Not very nice looking. So that's it for the placket. The only other thing you do is you can serge around this edge just to give it a nice tidy edge, or if you really want to have like a couture look, you can put a nice binding around that edge.